Joining us now to discuss the power of the passport, Graham Greene. He is executive editor of the Ottawa Citizen, but also former ambassador to Croatia for this country and an alternate representative to the United Nations Security Council. And Graham, it's good to see you there on the line from the nation's capital. How are you tonight?
Nice to be here. I'm fine, thank you.
Good to hear. We obviously wanted you in today because there have been some fairly high-profile cases of Canadians having difficulty abroad. And I want to start by doing something that might seem a little odd, but here's what it says about our passports. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada requests, in the name of Her Majesty the Queen, all those whom it may concern to allow the bearer to pass freely without let or hindrance, and to afford the bearer such assistance and protection as may be necessary. That's what it says in our passports, Graham, and I want to know, do foreign governments know that and believe it?
Oh, I think they know it. I mean, the passport is a document that allows you to travel across a border from one country to another. It's an identification document. So for that purpose, governments understand what it is. I think the crux of the question, though, is, well, what kind of protection or assistance can you expect when you're traveling on a Canadian passport? And I think that's what we can get into this evening.
Sure. Well, Canadians clearly think that this means that they can pass freely without hindrance wherever they go. Should they be under that impression?
I think in most cases, yes. We can, if you think the number of Canadians that travel every year without incident crossing a border, whether it's to the United States, to Europe, to Asia, to Africa, wherever, for most Canadians, the passport serves the purpose that it's intended to, which is to help them cross a border from one country to another. There are cases where having a Canadian passport doesn't help you. And that's where we come into some of these cases that we'll get into.
Does the passport protect you in any way when you're abroad?
Not really. It's not some magic document. People do not get any special treatment in any country because they're a Canadian. The purpose of a consular assistance is to ensure that you're treated no better, no worse than somebody that would be treated in that country if they were a citizen of that country. So you can't go and get preferential treatment because you're a Canadian, but by the same token, you shouldn't be discriminated against because you're a Canadian, treated more harshly or otherwise.
Well, you've led me nicely to the perhaps most high-profile example that Canadians have been focused on this issue over the last year, and that is the experience of that 31-year-old woman, Suad Haji Mohammed, who was detained in Kenya. Officials there said she couldn't prove her Canadian status, and there was a sense, I think it's fair to say, that Canadian consular officials let her down. They failed her. And now, of course, she's suing the Canadian government because she was held there against her will for a long time. Based on what you know about this case, Graham, do you think it's probably true that Canadian consular officials did, in fact, fail her?
They did. There's an investigation, a review going on by Foreign Affairs and by Border Security. The Prime Minister has asked both Minister Cannon and Mr. Van Loan to report to him on what happened. But, back in May, the High Commission in Kenya wrote a letter to the Kenyan authorities and stated definitively that they had concluded that she was not who she said she was and that she was an imposter. And we know from the DNA testing that she wasn't an imposter. So in that regard, yes, they failed her. And the big question is, why would the High Commission state so categorically from the outset that this was not the bearer of the passport, when the real issue was, did she look like a passport photo that was 4 years old? And we all know that our images change over time. You lose some weight, you change your hairstyle, you wear glasses or not glasses. It's possible to not look like your passport photo. So why would you state so categorically that this was not the person in the passport when we now have DNA evidence that in fact it was?
That's a great question. Do you have a supposition as to what the answer might be?
I don't know what they did to be conclusively investigating it. I mean, I think the letter said that we have conclusively investigated this. Well, you can't have conclusively investigated it to state categorically that the person is not who they say they are. You did have the option of a DNA test. If I had been writing that letter, I think I would have been a bit more careful in the wording and stated that, in the balance of probability, this person does not appear to be the person in the passport. We would like to carry out further tests, but for now we're not prepared to accept that this is the person in that passport. You need those kinds of caveats unless you know definitively that the person is not, and obviously they didn't.
And again, Canadians may be under the impression that that passport protects them when they're in foreign countries, but clearly the passport didn't help her this time, and she needed several months before they finally got this all resolved and she was repatriated. Why do you think it took so long?
You know, that's part of the review that both those ministries are going to have to conduct. Once a government official has stated something that categorically, both to a foreign government and up the chain of command to their own minister and obviously through that minister to the Prime Minister, it's very hard to climb down from that. So I guess the question is going to have to be what did that person who made that statement know to be able to say that? Was it reviewed by anybody further up the chain in the High Commission in Kenya or back here in Ottawa? And then once there was some doubt, why did it take so long to climb down from that or to accept taking a DNA sample to prove that?
Let me give you another example that the Toronto Star gave quite prominent play to earlier this week, a case of Maziar Gari, who has now been jailed 3 months in Iran, not charged with anything. Apparently, our officials at the United Nations walked out on the speech that was given by the Iranian President Ahmadinejad the other day, in part to protest the treatment given to this person. Can you tell me what impact that kind of thing has on a foreign leader?
The walkout, I don't think that it has much of an impact at all. I think that Mr. Ahmadinejad is quite happy to revel in the dislike that some countries have of him. So, you know, I think the protest was on more than just that. The walkout was because of some of the Holocaust denying that President Ahmadinejad has said repeatedly and as recently as earlier this month. So I don't think that that's going to have any bearing, good or bad, on helping a Canadian in Iran.
Countries such as the United States put protecting citizens abroad into law. Do we need that here?
I don't know that it would make much of a difference. You know, when you consider the number of Canadians who travel abroad, and the cases that have been in the news in the last few years, especially since 9/11, we're talking in 8 years, probably cases that you could count on the fingers of both hands that have reached that kind of level of publicity or prominence. So there are hundreds of thousands of Canadians who travel every year and have experiences with consular officials that meet or exceed their expectations. So I think in general, consular services are very well provided. I know from the time I was in the department that consular officers work very, very hard to help people, often going beyond the normal call of duty to assist people, particularly in remote places where you can't get that kind of assistance somewhere else through a commercial means. But there are going to be some cases where it falls down, and some of these, the cases that have been in the news have had some very, very dire consequences for the individuals involved.
Well, this is the thing. I think you're quite right about the math, but when the system cocks up, the cock-ups are just extraordinary. And you think of William Sampson, who spent a year in a Saudi prison being tortured the whole time, and you think about Mr. Abdul Razak, who's now suing the government for the treatment he suffered, the woman from Kenya as well. You know, when it goes south, it really goes south, doesn't it?
It does, and it's sort of like safety at a nuclear power station. I mean, the risk of something going wrong at a nuclear plant is very, very small, but if it goes wrong, it's a very, very big result. And the same thing applies with consular assistance abroad. If you get it right, nobody really knows about it. People expect it to work the way it does, and 99.9% of the time it does. But it's in that other 0.1% where things go wrong, where the consequences can be, in some cases, you miss a flight. In some cases, you don't have the medication that you need. In other cases, you can be thrown in jail and tortured for a year. So when the consequences can be as severe as some of them have been, we better be darn sure that we've done everything we can as Canadian officials to assist Canadians. And if we get it wrong, we better try to get it right as quickly as possible.
Now, not surprisingly, the power of the passport, or lack thereof, has become fodder for conversation in the city in which you find yourself tonight. And Michael Ignatieff, the leader of the Liberals, has suggested, as I think the tagline of his commercials is, that he can do better for people who are traveling abroad. Here is a clip of Mr. Ignatieff speaking to his Liberal caucus. Roll tape, please.
Stephen Harper hasn't just failed to stand up for Canada. He's also failed to stand up for Canadians. Swad Mohammed, Omar Khadr, Maktal, Bahari, Mohammed, Abdul Razik. Being a Canadian must mean that the Canadian government will stand up for you no matter where, no matter when. That is the heart of what every Liberal believes. A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. A liberal government would stand by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We would stand by our citizens, and we would bring forward legislation to protect Canadians abroad and make it illegal for the government to pick and choose which citizens it protects, to make sure these abuses never happen again.
Can I ask you, first of all, Graham, whether you agree with Mr. Ignatieff that the Harper government has failed to, quote, stand up for Canadians abroad?
I don't think they've failed to stand up any worse than the Chrétien or Martin governments before. A number of the people that he mentioned and a number of the people that have been in the news since 9/11, those detentions and those lack of services happened under Liberal government. So it's not a question of a Liberal government or a Conservative government. It's a question of the Canadian government and Canadian consular officials.
He did mention, though, that he would offer legislation if he were in a position to do so to protect Canadians better abroad. You told us earlier that you didn't think that would have much effect at the end of the day. So is what he's doing just sort of playing politics with this?
He's a politician. I mean, I think that's what he plays all the time. As I said earlier, 99.9% of the interactions between Canadian travelers and consular officials abroad are successful. They either meet or exceed the expectations of the Canadian traveler. So passing legislation for a very small number where we fall down as Canadian officials, I'm not sure that makes much of a difference. I know from personal experience that a consular officer feels awful when a consular case goes bad. Mm-hmm. It's their reputation, and they are there to provide a service. And it's not just the Canadian consular officials. It happens with U.S. and British. It's a very important part of the job of a Foreign Service officer to assist Canadians abroad. And when they get it wrong, they feel awful about it. But in some of these cases, clearly it went bad, and we don't know whether that was because of a deliberate policy problem, or whether it was lack of training, or whether it was incompetence, or what. And that's what the various reviews will look at in these specific cases.
Okay, if the Harper government has been, as you suggest, no more egregious on this than the Martin government or the Chrétien governments before it, I wonder if there is one area where the Harper government is definitely different in terms of policy from its predecessors. And I'm going to put this forward, and you give me your view on this. Public Safety Minister Stockwell Day said, "We will not actively pursue bringing back to Canada murderers who have been tried in a democratic country that supports the rule of law." Mm-hmm. So that's a change in policy between the Harper government and its predecessors. And I wonder if you think that's a good change in policy.
It is a change in policy, and that's a very deliberate one, and it's one that we know is a policy change as opposed to something that's been decided quietly, or just an official has made some decision to do something differently than before, or not the way the procedures are supposed to be followed. That's really something that the Conservatives campaigned on in terms of getting tough on crime, and voters decide whether they agree with that or not. The number of Canadian murderers abroad that would be affected by this is very small, but again, the consequences of this policy are very big, and it's something that I think Canadians need to decide, do they support that or not. But
Sure.
It's certainly a government's prerogative to make that decision. There's nothing in law that says that we have to either not extradite somebody because there's a death penalty in a particular country, or that we should seek to bring that person back to Canada because they are facing a death sentence.
No, I hear you, and I guess the examples that most often come up, and you're right, you could probably count them on the fingers of one hand this time rather than two, are, for example, in the United States where a Canadian is on death row for some crime committed in a state that provides for the death penalty. But I wonder if, Iraq today could be considered a democracy by some criteria, and they've had a couple of elections there, but you certainly wouldn't think of that country in the same way as you'd think of Canada, France, Britain, or United States. So if a Canadian were on death row in Iraq, would that pass the test of Mr. Days as well, do you think?
As far as I know, from what I've seen of what government ministers have said, it's a case-by-case basis. And the one place that they would draw the line is on mass murderers or multiple murderers. But in other cases, it would be case by case. I know people have criticized that, saying that you're picking and choosing who you like and who you don't like. But if there is a deliberate criteria that's put in place that people can debate and decide whether it's a valid criteria or not, Again, that's something for a government to decide as a policy and voters to decide on at the polls.
Okay.
So, you know, Iraq would be a case by case.
Right. Let's move into the final chapter of our discussion here, and I want to sort of come full circle, come back to the Swad Haji Mohammed case, the woman who was in Kenya for a few months because the passport pictures allegedly didn't match up. And it gets into issues, certainly she thought it did, of tolerance and perhaps racism. And I want to read you this press release from the Canadian Muslim Congress that came out earlier this summer. The Muslim Canadian Congress has welcomed Prime Minister Harper's decision to intervene directly in the matter of the Somali Canadian woman stranded in Nairobi, but is asking Ottawa to immediately suspend the Canadian Vice Consul in Kenya, Ms. Lilian Kadur. In a statement, Sohail Raza, president of the MCC, said it is regrettable that Ottawa took so long to step in, but as a first step it should immediately suspend Ms. Lilian Kadur, who is directly responsible for sending a Canadian citizen to a Kenyan prison on false charges that had all the hallmarks of a racist mindset. Raza said the actions of Lilian Kadur, who is said to be an Egyptian Canadian, must be seen in the context of widespread racism against black Africans in the Arab world. Quote, there is clear evidence that black Africans are ill-treated by Egyptians and racism against blacks is widespread in the Arab world. We hope any investigation by Ottawa into the actions of Lilian Kadur will take such racism into account. Okay, this is obviously tricky stuff, but do you believe racism, based on what you know, was a factor in her situation?
Well, I haven't been party to the review that's being done by the department, and I'm delighted that the Congress is in a position to reach that kind of a conclusion based on press reports. They have no more information than we do.
So when you say you're delighted, you're not really delighted. You're being facetious here.
I'm being facetious here. I mean, you know, there is a process that needs to be followed, and the review is underway. The Prime Minister has asked the two ministers to report directly to him on what happened, and they will look at all aspects of this. Was this a deliberate action by an employee that contravened the policy? Was it an employee who wasn't fully briefed on what the policy should be? Was the employee working on incorrect information that was provided to them? You know, those are all things that have to be looked at before you can reach a conclusion. Now, you know, there's a lot of things in that statement that you read about whether there's racism subjected to black Africans by Egyptians. That may be, it may not be. There may be enough evidence of that, but does that apply in this particular case? I think it's far too early to start applying labels like that when a review is still underway.
Another charge, Muslims are not getting fair treatment from Canadian consular officials abroad. We hear that frequently. What do you think?
I think the high-profile cases that have been in the news have been predominantly Muslims. And I don't think that's surprising in the post-9/11 era when security is a very high issue for consular and embassy staff abroad. There are going to be more incidents from people traveling from certain countries or visiting certain countries. I do not believe that the department and its officials abroad are discriminating against Muslims, whether they are focusing more attention on particular groups of people from particular countries or who've traveled to those countries because of possible security threats emanating from those countries. That's certainly a possibility. So you would have more people getting caught up in those kinds of security situations. But to suggest that it's a deliberate targeting of Muslims because they're Muslims, I think is unfair to the officials that work abroad for us.
Okay, well, let's see if... Can we put it this way? Do you think that Muslims are increasingly under a sharper microscope in a post-9/11 world by Canadian consular officials?
I think people who travel to certain countries or certain regions are under a bigger microscope, regardless of their religion. But if you're traveling as a dual national to a country that is predominantly Muslim, the chances are you're going to be a Muslim traveling there. And so in that case, yes, I think that the fact that Muslims will travel to those countries more often than non-Muslims, and they'll get caught up in the security inspections or net. Yes, I think that's the case, but I don't think it's targeting the religion. I think it's targeting the countries to which people travel or pass through.
Well, you know what people will say, Graham. I mean, the case of Brenda Martin in Mexico. At the end of the day, and yes, she did languish down there for a very long time. But at the end of the day, I think the Canadian government sent a plane down there to pick her up and bring her back, which seemed to be better treatment than a lot of Muslim Canadians got from their government when confronted with some very similar allegations. What are we to infer from all this?
Well, I don't think there's many of the cases that have been in the news in the last 8 years that sending a plane would have helped or otherwise. I mean, when we're talking about Maher Arar or others who were in Syrian jail, sending a plane was not going to get him back to Canada any faster while he was in detention there. So, you know, you do what you have to do in each of the countries, in each of the circumstances, and yes, I think the optics of that were very bad, but it may have been the best solution to get that case resolved as quickly as possible.
In our last minute and change here, let me ask you about the courts. What do you think the role of the Canadian legal system is in dealing with a lot of these issues we've been talking about tonight?
Well, thank goodness that we have the courts, because if you look at the various checks that the courts have put on Canadian security legislation and Canadian actions over the years, it's been very impressive. And the Supreme Court Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin just this week at a speech in Ottawa talked about the need not to do just an either or between security and human rights. There has to be a balance, and it's the courts that have to ensure that whatever policies we have and practices we put in place, that we do, we balance that security requirement with the obligation to protect people's constitutional rights. And the courts have demonstrated their willingness to step in and tell the Canadian government when it's acted improperly and order redress.
Understood. I guess as we finish up here, Graham, I should offer a couple of thank yous. Number one, to you for joining us this evening, and number two, to your mother, who allowed you to be with us on this, her 75th birthday. We wish her well, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thanks, Steve, and I'm sure my mother thanks you.